The 21st Voyage. Upon my return from the 27th century, I sent Ijon Tichy off to Rosenweiser to take over the post vacated by me at Theo-Hip-Hip, which he did, though with the greatest reluctance, and then only after a week of scenes and running about in the little loop in time. This done, I found myself faced with a serious dilemma. Say what you will, but personally I had had quite enough of improving history. At the same time, it was entirely possible that that other Tichy would again make a mess of the whole project, and Rosenweiser would send for me once more. I decided, therefore, not to wait around with folded hands, but take off for the galaxy, and the farther the better. I left in the greatest haste, afraid that Moira might try and stop me, but apparently things were at loose ends there after my departure, since no one took any particular interest in me somehow. Obviously, I didn't want to run off just anywhere, so I brought along a pile of the latest guidebooks, and also the annual supplement to the Galactic Almanac, which had grown in my absence. Having put a tidy number of parsecs between myself and the sun, I felt safe at last and started thumbing through this literature. As I soon discovered, it contained quite a bit that was new. Here Dr. Hofstosser, the brother of Hofstosser the famous theologian, had worked out a periodic table of civilizations in the universe, based on 3 principles which enabled one infallibly to locate highly advanced societies. These were the laws of trash, of noise, and of spots. Every civilization at the technological stage gradually finds itself up to its ears in garbage, which causes tremendous problems until the dumps are moved out into cosmic space and put, moreover, in a specially designated orbit, to keep them from getting too much in the way of the astronauts. In this fashion, one obtains a growing ring of refuse, and it is precisely its presence that indicates a higher level of development. However, after a certain time, the trash changes in character, for with successive strides in intellectronics it becomes necessary to dispose of ever greater quantities of obsolete computer hardware, to which old probes, modules, and satellites attach themselves. These thinking junk heaps have no desire to spend the rest of eternity revolving around in a ring of garbage, and so they break away, filling up the regions about the planet and even its entire system. This stage leads to the pollution of the environment with intelligence. Different civilizations try to combat the problem in different ways. Occasionally you have cyberneticide. For example, special traps are placed in space, snares, mines, lures for sentient flotsam and jetsam. But the effect of such measures couldn't be worse, since only the inferior garbage, inferior mentally, lets itself be caught. Consequently, this tactic actually selects out the more perceptive of the trash. These band together in groups and gangs, organize raids and demonstrations, and the demands they present are difficult to meet, namely spare parts and a place to settle down. If you refuse, they maliciously jam radio communications, interrupt programs, broadcast their own announcements, as a result of which the planet, in this phase, becomes surrounded by a zone of such static and howling in the ether you can't hear yourself think. It is precisely by this crackling that one can detect, even at a great distance, civilizations plagued with intellectual pollution. Odd how long it took the astronomers of Earth to figure out why the universe, according to their radio telescopes, was so full of noise and other senseless sounds. This is nothing more or less than interference produced by those above-mentioned conflicts, which seriously impede the establishment of interstellar contact. And finally, the sunspots, but sunspots of specific shape as well as chemical composition, which can be determined spectroscopically. They betray the presence of the most advanced civilizations of all, those that have broken the trash barrier and the noise barrier, too. The spots occur when enormous swarms of junk accumulated over the ages hurl themselves like moths into the fire of the local sun, there to perish in mass self-immolation. This mania is induced by certain depressants to whose influence everything that thinks electrically succumbs. The sowing of these deadly agents is unspeakably cruel, but then existence in our universe, and especially the setting up of civilizations within it, is unfortunately a grim business and no picnic. According to Dr. Hofstosser, these 3 consecutive stages of development are an iron rule for all humanoid civilizations. As far as the others go, the good doctor's periodic table still shows certain gaps. This, however, was no hindrance to me, since for understandable reasons I was interested primarily in the life of beings most like ourselves. So then, following the specifications published by Hofstosser in the Almanac, I assembled an ass finder, advanced sidereal societies, and before long had entered the great cluster of the Hyades. For it was from there that particularly strong jamming came, there that the greatest number of planets were encircled with belts of trash, and there, too, that several suns were covered with dark eruptions having a spectrum of rare elements, which bore mute testimony to the annihilation of artificial intelligence. And since the last issue of the Almanac provided photographs of the inhabitants of Diatica, strikingly similar to people, it was on this planet that I decided to land. True, considering the considerable distance of 1,000 light-years at which these pictures were taken radio-astronomically by Dr. Hofstosser, they could have been a bit outdated. Nevertheless, it was with great hopes that I approached Diatica in a hyperbolic path and, assuming a circular orbit, requested permission to land. Obtaining such permission is often a far more difficult thing than conquering the galactic void, since bureaucracy accompanies progress at a higher exponential rate than does navigation. Therefore, photon reactors, shields, supplies of fuel, oxygen, etc., have much less importance than vouchers and receipts, without which one can't even think of entry visas. Being an old hand at all of this, I was prepared for a long spell, possibly many months, of circling Datica, but not prepared for what I encountered. The planet, as I was able to make out, resembled Earth in the blueness of its sky, was covered with oceans, too, and furnished with 3 large and definitely populated continents. Even at a distance perimeter, I had to look sharp to thread my way between the different satellites, the sentinel type, the observational, the spying, prying, and those that just sat there quietly. The latter I gave as wide a berth as possible, taking no chances. There was no response to my petitions. 3 times I submitted an application, but no one demanded the televising of my papers. They only shot something at me from the continent shaped like a kidney, entwined with multicolored ribbons and streamers and bearing inscriptions. Encouraging inscriptions, it would appear, yet worded so vaguely that I decided against flying through the arch. The next continent, bristling with cities, fired a milky white cloud at me. Some sort of powder it was, which befuddled all the computers on board in such a way that they immediately tried steering the ship into the sun. I had to shut them off and switch over to manual control. The third landmass, apparently less urbanized, submerged in luxuriant vegetation, the largest of the 3, shot off nothing in my direction, greeted me with nothing. So, finding a secluded spot, I threw on the brakes and carefully set the rocket down in a glen of picturesque hills and meadows, overgrown with either turnips or sunflowers. It was hard to say at that altitude. As usual, the door was stuck, heated up from the atmospheric friction, and I had to wait a good while before it could be opened. I put my head outside, filled my lungs with the fresh, invigorating air, and cautiously set foot on this unknown world. I found myself at the edge of what looked to be a cultivated field, except that what was growing on it had nothing in common with sunflowers or turnips. They weren't even plants. They were night tables. In other words, a type of furniture. And as if that wasn't enough, here and there between them, in fairly even rows, stood cabinets and footstools. After a little thought, I came to the conclusion that these were products of a biotic civilization. I had seen such things before. The apocalyptic visions that futurologists sometimes unfold before us, of a world choked with lethal fumes, filled with smoke, hopelessly trapped by the energy barrier, the thermal barrier, etc., they're complete nonsense. In the post-industrial phase of development, one sees the rise of biotic engineering, which liquidates those kinds of problems. Mastery of the secrets of life permits the production of synthetic seed, which can be planted in practically anything. You sprinkle a little water over it and grow what you need in no time at all. As to where the thing draws its information and energy to become a radio or cupboard, you needn't concern yourself, any more than we worry about how a spore acquires the strength and knowledge to sprout into a weed. So it wasn't the field of cabinets and bedstands itself that surprised me, but the fact that they were totally denaturalized. The closest night table, when I tried to open it, nearly bit off my hand with its toothed drawer. The second one, growing beside it, quivered in the breeze like jellied meat, and one of the stools I walked past stuck out its leg and sent me sprawling. No, that wasn't at all how furniture was supposed to behave. There was clearly something wrong with this agriculture. Forging ahead, though now with the utmost care and keeping a finger on the trigger of my blaster, I came, at a slight depression in the terrain, upon a thicket in the style of Louis XV, out of which there leaped a wild settee, and would have surely trampled me with its gilded hooves had I not floored it with a well-aimed shot. I wandered for a time between clumps of furniture suites that exhibited hybridization not only of styles but of functions. Crossbreeds ran riot there, credenzas with ottomans, branching buffets, and the wardrobes, thrown wide open as if inviting one to step inside. They were probably predators, judging by the half-eaten scraps at their feet. I could see now that this was no crop, but pure chaos. Weary and suffering from the heat, for the sun was at its zenith, I found, after several unsuccessful tries, a remarkably quiet armchair and sat in it to gather my thoughts. I was sitting there in the shade of a bunch of large, though wild commodes, which had sprouted numerous hangers, when not more than 100 feet away a head emerged from between some high swaying cornices, and after the head, the trunk of some creature. It didn't look to me like a man, but on the other hand, definitely had nothing to do with furniture. It stood erect, covered with glossy blonde fur. The face I couldn't see, its broad-rimmed hat was in the way. In place of a belly, it had what seemed to be a tambourine. The arms were tapered, ending in double hands. Humming softly, it accompanied itself on that abdominal drum, or whatever. It took a step forward, then another, revealing its continuation. The thing resembled a centaur now, though barefoot and without hooves. Then a third pair of legs appeared behind the second, and then a fourth. But when it went bounding off into the brush and disappeared from view, I lost count. There were less than 100, though, that much I knew. I sat back in my upholstered chair, not a little stunned by this strange encounter, but finally got up and went on, taking care not to stray too far from the rocket. Among some full-grown sofas, all standing on end, I saw a pile of stone rubble, and farther on, the opening of an ordinary storm drain. As I drew closer in order to peer into its dark interior, I heard a rustling behind me. I started to turn around, but a sheet dropped over my head. I struggled, in vain, for arms of steel now held me fast. Someone kicked the legs out from under me. Twisting helplessly, I felt myself being lifted up, then grasped by the shoulders and ankles. They carried me downwards, it seemed. I could hear the sound of steps on flagstones, the creaking of a door. Then I was thrown on my knees, and the smothering fabric torn from my head. I was in a small chamber lit with white bulbs attached to the ceiling. These also had whiskers and little feet, and from time to time would change their position. Someone standing over me held me by the neck, forcing me to kneel before a rough-hewn table. Behind it sat a figure in a gray hood, which covered his face completely. The hood had holes for the eyes, fitted with transparent panes. This figure, putting aside a book he had been reading, gave me a passing glance and said calmly to the one who kept me in his grip, "Pull its cord." Someone grabbed my ear and pulled until I yelped with pain. 2 more times they tried to tear off my lobe, and when it wouldn't come, there was much consternation. The one who had been holding me and pulling, similarly swathed in coarse gray cloth, said in an apologetic tone that this was evidently a new model. Another thug came up and attempted in turn to screw off my nose, my eyebrows, finally the whole head. When that too failed to give the desired results, the seated one ordered me released, and asked, "How deep are you hidden?" "How what?" I asked, dumbfounded. "I'm not hiding anywhere, and don't understand a thing. Why are you torturing me?" At that point, the seated one stood up, came around the table, and took me by the shoulders. His hands were human, but in linen gloves. Feeling my bones, he gave a small cry of astonishment. At a given signal, I was taken down a corridor where the light bulbs were crawling along the ceiling, clearly bored, and into another cell, more precisely a cubicle, and black as a tomb. I didn't want to enter it, but they shoved me in anyway and slammed the door. Something buzzed, and from behind an invisible partition I heard a voice exclaim, as if in heavenly ecstasy, "What lovely bones! What lovely little bones!" After hearing this, I put up an even greater struggle when they dragged me from that closet, but seeing how they now treated me with unexpected deference, respectfully bowing and gesturing for me to follow, I let myself be led deep into a subterranean passageway, remarkably like a city sewer main, though it was all scrubbed clean, with the walls whitewashed and the bottom sprinkled with fine white sand. My hands were now free, and as we walked, I rubbed all the injured places on my face and body. 2 individuals in gray floor-length cowls, girded with rope, opened a door made of rough boards, and there inside the cell, which was somewhat larger than the one where they had tried to twist my nose and ears off, stood a hooded man, clearly moved at the sight of me. After 15 minutes of conversation, I formed more or less the following picture of the situation. I was in the monastery of a local religious order, which either was hiding from some unknown persecution, or else had been outlawed. They had mistaken me for an entrapment decoy, since my appearance, being an object of veneration to the demolition friars, was prohibited by law. The prior, for it was the prior with whom I spoke, explained that had I in fact been a decoy, I would have been composed of segments which, upon the pulling of the inner cord, attached to the ear, should have fallen into little pieces. As for the second question which the interrogating monk, the elder brother gatekeeper, had put to me, he had thought that I represented a type of plastic mannequin with a built-in pocket computer. It was only the X-rays that revealed the truth. The prior, Father Diaz Darg, apologized profusely for the results of that unfortunate misunderstanding, and added that he was returning me my freedom, but didn't advise going out on the surface, where I would surely find myself in serious danger, for I was censorable in my entirety. Nor would being fitted with a bowel sac and retractable liver stalks render me safe, untutored as I was in the use of such camouflage. The best thing for me to do, therefore, was to stay with the demolition friars as their esteemed and welcome guest. To the extent of their all-too-modest abilities, they would try to make my confinement as unburdensome as possible. I wasn't particularly happy about this arrangement, yet the prior inspired my confidence with his stately bearing, his serenity, the pith of his utterances, though indeed I couldn't accustom myself to his masked appearance, for he was dressed as all the other monks. I was hesitant to ply him with questions all at once, so we talked about the weather on Earth and on Datica. I had already told him whence I came, and then, too, about the tedium of cosmic travel. Finally, he said that he could well imagine my curiosity concerning local affairs. However, there was no real hurry, seeing as how I was obliged in any case to hide myself from the long arm of the censor. I would receive, as an honored guest, his own cell, also a novice to provide whatever assistance or advice was necessary, besides which the entire monastic library stood open to me. and since it contained innumerable prohibita and incunabula found on blacklists and indexes, the accident which had brought me to these catacombs might profit me more than if I had landed elsewhere. I thought that we would part company now, for the prior rose, but instead he asked, almost timidly, if I would permit him, as he put it, to touch my actual person. With a deep sigh, as if in an excess of the greatest sorrow or some unfathomable regret, he placed his hard-gloved fingers upon my nose, forehead, cheeks, and as he stroked my hair, I had the impression that the hand of that holy man was made of iron. He even started softly sobbing. These signs of pent emotion bewildered me completely. I didn't know what to ask first, whether about the furniture run wild, or the centaur with the many legs, or this censorship he spoke of, but prudently restraining myself, I said nothing. The prior assured me that the brothers of the order would see to the camouflaging of my rocket, making it resemble organs suffering from elephantiasis, whereupon we parted with an exchange of civilities. The cell I received was small but homey, with a bed, unfortunately, as hard as the devil. I assumed that this was the sort of stern rule the demolition friars had, but it turned out later that they simply forgot to put down a pallet for me. So far I felt no other hunger than that for information. The young novice under whose charge I was brought me whole armfuls of historical and philosophical works. I pored over these till late at night. My reading was hampered at first by the fact that the lamp would sometimes come over and sometimes leave for another corner of the room. Later on I learned that it went off to relieve itself, but would return to its former position when whistled for. The novice suggested I begin with a short but instructive outline of Dichotican history penned by one Abuz Groggs, the official historiographer, yet objective enough for all that, as he put it. I followed this counsel. As recently as the year 2300, the Dichoticans were the exact counterpart of people. Though progress in the sciences was indeed accompanied by the secularization of life, duism, a faith that had reigned practically unopposed for 20 centuries on Dichotica, left its mark on the subsequent course of civilization as well. Duism holds that every life knows two deaths, the one ahead and the one behind, or in other words, that before birth and that following the final breath. The Dichotican theologians later would throw up their hands in amazement upon hearing from me that on earth we didn't think in this fashion, that there were churches which concerned themselves with one thing only, namely the hereafter ahead, that it was upsetting for people to think that someday they would be no longer, but not equally upsetting for them to consider the fact that earlier they had never been. This the good friars could not understand. Duism had modified its doctrine in the space of 100 years, but throughout maintained a lively interest in eschatological problems, and this was what led, in the lifetime of Professor Groggs, to the first attempts to launch an immortalization technology. As everyone knows, we die because we age, and we age, that is, we undergo physical breakdown, through the loss of vital information. Our cells, in time, forget how not to decay. Nature keeps only the germ cells supplied with this knowledge, for the others are of absolutely no concern to her. Aging, then, is the depletion of information essential for the maintenance of life. Bradagh Fizz, inventor of the first perpetuator, constructed a unit which, tending the human organism, I use the term human here in speaking of the Dichoticans, purely for the sake of convenience, gathered every scrap of information lost by the somatic cells and instantly restored the same to them. The first Dichotican, Degundar Brabs, on whom eternitization was performed, became immortal for only a year. Longer than that he couldn't hold out, for a battery of 60 machines watched over him, penetrating every nook and cranny of his being with countless gold electrodes. Unable to move a muscle, he led a pitiful existence in the midst of a veritable factory, an imperpetuatron. Dr. Gwarg, the next immortal, could indeed walk about, though he was accompanied on his strolls by a column of heavy tractors laden with the necessary immortalizing equipment. He, too, committed suicide out of frustration. Still, the prevailing opinion was that with continued technological progress, micro-perpetuators would eventually be developed. Hasberger, however, demonstrated mathematically that a pube, personal umbilico-bioeternitizer ensemble, at the very least, had to weigh 169 times more than the one perpetuated, to the extent, of course, that the latter conformed to a typically evolutional design. This because, as I said before, and as even our own scientists know, nature is solicitous about a handful of reproductive cells in each individual, and the rest can go hang. Has's proof made a powerful impression and plunged society deep into despair, for it was understood that the mortality barrier could not be crossed without at the same time abandoning the body which nature had provided. In philosophy, one reaction to Has's proof was the famous doctrine of that great Dichotican sage Donderwarg. Spontaneous death, he wrote, can hardly be called natural. Natural is that which is fitting. Mortality, on the other hand, constitutes an outrage, a disgrace of truly cosmic proportions. the commonness of the offense in no way mitigates its enormity, nor, in assessing the offense, does it make the least difference whether or not the perpetrator can be apprehended. Nature has dealt with us deceitfully, sending innocent people off on a mission purportedly pleasant, in reality hopeless. In life, the more one gains in wisdom, the nearer one draws to the pit. No decent person ought to associate with murderers. By the same token, any collaboration with that greatest of criminals, nature, is inexcusable. Yet what is burial but collaboration through a game of hide and seek? The point being to dispose of the body, as accomplices are wont to do. On the tombstones, various inconsequential things are written, save the only one that is material. For if people would but dare to look the truth in the eye, they would be carving there instead a couple of the more pungent profanities, addressed to Mother Nature, for it is she who got us into this. Meanwhile, no one breathes a word, as if a murderer, clever enough always to get away with it, deserved for that some special consideration. Not memento mori, but estote ultores, onward to immortality. That should be the cry, even if it means parting with our traditional appearance. Such was the ontological testament of that eminent philosopher. As I finished reading this, the novice appeared, to invite me on behalf of the prior to partake of their humble fare. I dined in the prior's exclusive company. Father Dark himself ate nothing, but only now and then sipped water from a crystal goblet. The repast was modest, table-leg stew, a bit stringy. It seemed clear to me, then, that the furniture of the adjoining countryside, growing wild, turned predominantly to flesh. However, I didn't ask why it wouldn't sooner turn to wood. The reading had set my mind on higher matters. Thus came about my first conversation with the prior. The topic was theology. He explained to me that duism is a belief in God divested of all dogma, its articles of faith having been one by one destroyed in the course of various biotic revolutions. The Church's most difficult crisis was brought on by the crumbling of the dogma of the immortal soul, immortal in the sense of the prospect of an everlasting life. In the 25th century, this dogma was challenged by three successive technologies, the refrigerational, the reversional, and the psychoinceptive. The first consisted in turning a man into ice, the second in reversing the direction of an individual organism's development, and the third in the free manipulation of mind. The cryostatic challenge could be refuted easily enough by maintaining that the death into which a person fell when frozen, but was later revived, was not the death of which the Holy Scriptures spoke, where afterwards the soul flies off into the great beyond. Indeed, there was no other possible interpretation, for if we were dealing here with ordinary death, then obviously a resurrectee should have some knowledge of where he had been, in spirit, during the 100 or 600 years of his decease. Some theologians, for example Galger Drebdar, felt that true death took place only upon decomposition, and unto dust shalt thou return. However, this version didn't hold up, what with the introduction of the so-called revivificational field, which could put together a living man precisely out of dust, that is, from a body reduced to atoms, for in that case, too, the one revivified had absolutely no knowledge of his soul going anywhere in the interim. The dogma was preserved then only through the careful avoidance of any designation as to when death was sufficiently out and out for one to say with certainty that the soul had left the body. But then came reversible ontogeny. It hadn't been intentionally leveled at religious doctrine, but proved invaluable for the removal of defects in fetal development. Science had learned how to arrest this development and back it up, turning it around 180 degrees, in order to begin once more from the fertilized cell. Then suddenly the dogma of immaculate conception, as well as that of the immortal soul, were in serious trouble, and both at one blow. For thanks to retroembryological techniques, it was now possible to move any specimen back through all its previous stages, and even to make the fertilized cell from which it sprang divide back into an egg and sperm. This presented quite a problem, for according to dogma, God created the soul at the moment of conception. But if one could reverse conception and thereby annul it, separating both its components, what then happened to the already created soul? One spin-off of this technology was cloning, that is, the inducing of any cell whatever, taken from the living body, say from the nose, the heel, the lining of the palate, etc., to develop into a normal organism. And as this took place entirely without fertilization, we clearly had here the bioengineering of immaculate conception, which in due course was commercialized and applied on a mass scale. Embryogeny by now could also be slowed down, stepped up, or deflected in such a way as to turn the human fetus, for instance, into something simian. And what of the soul then? Was it compressed and drawn out like an accordion, or in the switching of the embryo from the human to the simian track, did it simply disappear somewhere along the line? But dogma said that the soul, once created, could neither disappear nor be diminished, for it was an entity unto itself and indivisible. Consideration was already being given to the possibility of excommunicating these prenatal engineers. This, however, was not done, and rightly, too, for ectogenesis had now become widespread. First, no one to speak of, then no one at all, was born of man and woman, but instead from a cell implanted in a uterator, an artificial womb, and one could hardly deny all humankind the sacraments on the grounds that it arose parthenogenetically, that is, by virgin birth. Then along came on top of this the next technology, that of consciousness. The problem of the ghost in the machine, posed by intellectronics and its thinking computers, could be dealt with, more or less, but it was followed by other problems, by minds and intelligences in liquids. Sentient, reasoning solutions were synthesized, and these could be bottled, poured, mixed, and after each time you ended up with a new personality, one often more spiritual and wiser than all the Dichoticans put together. The question of whether a machine or fluid could possess a soul was the subject of much heated debate at the Ecumenical Council of 2479, till finally they promulgated there a new dogma, the dogma of second-hand creation, which stated that God had invested the intelligent beings of his making with the power to engender intelligence twice removed. But even that wasn't an end to the transmutations, for it soon turned out that artificial mentalities could themselves produce others, successors, or even synthesize for reasons of their own, not only creatures of humanoid appearance, but perfectly real people, using any old pile of material for that purpose. There were other attempts made later on to preserve the dogma of immortality, but these collapsed beneath the onslaught of subsequent discoveries, which in a veritable avalanche descended upon the 26th century. No sooner would a new interpretation be offered to bolster the beleaguered dogma than a new technology arose to negate it. This led to a number of heresies and the springing up of sects, all of which stood in direct contradiction to universally acknowledged facts. Meanwhile, the duistic church kept in force one dogma only, that of second-hand creation. But as far as life after death went, and faith in the continuation of personal identity, it was no longer possible to stave off defeat, since neither personality nor individuality remained intact in this world. You could now mix two or more minds into one, with machines and solutions, and with people, too. You could, thanks to functional noetics, produce whole worlds inside machines, worlds that gave rise to intelligent beings, beings which in turn were able within the confines of their prison to construct yet another generation of sentient entities. You could expand mentality, divide it, multiply it, factor it, retract it, and so on. The decline of dogma spelt the decline of the Church's authority. Hope in the world to come, despite assurances given earlier, was extinguished, at least for individual persons. Seeing that theological progress wasn't keeping up with technological, the Council of 2542 established the Order of the Prognosticants, who were to engage in futurological research in the area of the Holy Faith. For the need to anticipate its further vicissitudes was pressing. The amorality of many new biotechniques alarmed not only the true believers. With modern cloning methods, for example, it was possible to produce, besides normal individuals, biological beings that were practically brainless, thus fit for mechanical tasks. Possible even to upholster rooms and walls with suitably cultivated tissues that came from human or animal bodies. Possible also to produce inserts, plugs, amplifiers, as well as modulators of intelligence. To create states of mystical transport in a computer, in a fluid. To take a frog's egg and turn it into a sage with the body of a man, or a sage with the body of an animal hitherto unknown, being specially designed by the experts in fetal architecture. There was strong opposition, and from secular quarters too, but to no avail. All this Father Darg related with the utmost tranquility, as though he spoke of self-evident things. Indeed, for him, they were self-evident, belonging as they did to Dichotican history. Countless questions came rushing to my lips, yet I did not wish to seem importunate. And so, retiring to my cell after supper, I sat down with the second volume of Professor A. Gragg's work. This one, as the annotation on the first page indicated, was forbidden. I learned that in the year 2401, Big Brogar, Dire Daggard, and Murder threw open the gates to limitless auto-evolutionary freedom. These scholars earnestly believed that Homo autofac sapiens, the self-made man, made possible by their discovery, would achieve the ultimate in harmony and happiness, endowing himself with those aspects of form and qualities of spirit he judged to be most perfect, and break the mortality barrier itself if he so desired. In short, they displayed throughout the Second Biotic Revolution, it was to the first that we owed the seminal production of consumer goods, the kind of wild-eyed optimism so common in the history of science. For such hopes usually attend the appearance of any great and new technology. At first, auto-evolutionary engineering, or, as they called it, the fetalistic movement, burgeoned in a way that seemed to accord with the expectations of its illustrious inventors. Ideals in health, congruity, spiritual and physical beauty became universalized. By constitutional law, every citizen was guaranteed the right to acquire whatever psychic or somatic attributes were deemed the most desirable. Soon, too, all deformities and congenital defects, all ugliness and stupidity, were rendered obsolete. But progress has this about it, that it is driven ever onward by its own advance. Hence things did not stop there. The transformations that followed seemed innocent enough at the outset. Young women beautified themselves by the cultivation of epidermal jewelry and other efflorescences of the flesh, valentine ears, cuticle pearls. Young men sported side and back beards, coxcomb crests, jaws with double bites, etc. 20 years later, the first majority parties came into being. It took a while before I realized, reading, that majority party meant something different on Diatica than it did to us. In opposition to the majority party platform that called for the proliferation of anatomies, there was the minority group, which advocated reductionism, that is, the elimination of those organs considered by the minority leaders of various factions to be non-vital. I had just gotten to this fascinating place in the text when suddenly my novice burst into the cell without knocking and, betraying great agitation, told me to collect my things at once, for the brother gatekeeper had sounded the alarm. I inquired what the trouble was, but he urged me to hurry, crying that there wasn't a moment to lose. I had no personal effects, only the book, so putting it under my arm, I ran after my guide. In the underground refectory, all the demolition friars were working at a fever pitch. Down a stone spout tumbled heaps of books, pushed from above by brethren librarians with poles, then loaded into vessels, and with the greatest haste, lowered down a well cut out of solid rock. Before my very eyes, the monks then stripped themselves naked, and as quickly as possible threw their frocks and cowls also in the stone-cased opening. They were robots, all of them, and only roughly humanoid in form. Next they set to work on me, crowding around, gluing to my body strange appendages, balloon-shaped, snake-like, tails or limbs, I couldn't tell which, so swiftly was it done. The prior himself set on my head a bowel sack, which looked something like a blown-up, split-open cockroach. Some were still gluing, others had begun painting me with bands or stripes. There being no mirror around, nor shiny surface, I couldn't see myself, but they seemed pleased with the overall effect. Given a shove, I found myself in a corner. It was only then that I noticed I resembled more a quadruped, or perhaps even a sextuped, than any upright being. They told me to stay squatted and answer all questions in the event that any were asked of me, with a ba. The next thing I knew, there was a fearful pounding at the door. The robot friars rushed over to some sort of apparatuses that had been dragged out into the middle of the refectory, and which resembled, though not really, sewing machines. Then the entire room was filled with the din of their simulated labor. Down the stone steps and towards us walked the inspectors. I nearly fell off all four of my feet when I got a good look at them. I didn't know whether they were clothed or naked. Each produced an altogether different impression. All, I believe, had tails that ended in a tuft of hair concealing a sizable fist. They carried them, as a rule, carelessly slung over the shoulder, to the extent that one could call a bulbous protuberance encircled with huge warts a shoulder. The skin in the middle of this bulge was white as milk. On it appeared stigmata in various colors. After a while I realized that they communicated, not only by voice, but also by flashing, on that body screen of theirs, different captions and abbreviations. I tried counting their legs, and found that they had a minimum of 2 apiece, though there were also a couple of 3-leggers and a 5er. It did seem, however, that the greater number of legs one had, the more he tended to trip. They went poking around the entire hall, examining the monks in a perfunctory way as the latter hunched over their machines and worked with the utmost intensity, till finally the head inspector, taller than the rest, and with an enormous orange membrane atop of his bowel sack, which distended and glowed feebly when he spoke, ordered the short one, barely a biped, and with a skimpy tail, a clerk, no doubt, to have a look at the fripple winches. They jotted something down, took measurements, this without so much as a word to the robot friars, and were about to leave when a greenish 3-legger took notice of me. He tugged at one of my fringed extremities, so just in case I gave a quiet bleat. "Hey, it's that old thumbnist. He certified bugs. Let him be," said the big one, brightening, and the little one quickly replied, "Very good, your bodyship." With an instrument similar to a flashlight, they made another tour of the refectory, but didn't even bother with the well. More and more this looked to me like the carrying out of a formality. 10 minutes later they were gone. The machines went off into a dark corner, the monks began hoisting up the vessels, wrung out their soaking frocks, then hung them on a line to dry. The brother librarians shook their heads ruefully, for water had gotten into one of the leaky barrels, which meant they immediately had to sandwich blotting paper in between the soaked pages of those ancient texts. Meanwhile the prior, that is, the father robot, I no longer knew just how or what to think of him, approached me with a smile and said that everything, praise be, had ended well, but in the future I must watch myself. Here he pointed to the history book I had dropped in the general confusion. He himself had sat on it during the entire search. "Then the possession of books is forbidden?" I asked. "It depends on who is doing the possessing," said the prior. "For us, yes, and especially those kinds of books. We are looked upon as old machines, unneeded ever since the first Biotic revolution. They tolerate us, like everything else here in the catacombs, for such has been the custom, unofficial, mind you, since the reign of Glauban. And what is a Thumnist? I asked. The prior seemed embarrassed. A follower of Bezugus Thumna, who governed some 90 years ago. It's awkward for me to speak of this. An unfortunate Thumnist did seek refuge among us, and so we took him in. He always sat in that corner, pretended, poor man, not to be in his right mind, thanks to which he was never held accountable and could say what he liked. Last month he had himself frozen to wait for better days, so I thought that in case of an emergency, you understand, we might dress you up, yes? I was going to tell you, but didn't have the chance. I didn't expect a search so soon. They are irregular, but as of late fairly infrequent. Of this I understood not a word. At any rate, I was now in store for a great deal of unpleasantness, since the glue used by the demolition friars to disguise me as that Thumnist held like the dickens, and it felt as if they were pulling off those artificial wattle flaps and liver stalks along with pieces of my own flesh. I sweated, I groaned, till finally, more or less restored to human form, I turned in for the night. Later on, the prior suggested that I could be physically altered, in a reversible way, of course, but when they showed me a picture of how that would look, I decided instead to risk remaining censorable. The officially prescribed shapes were not only monstrous in my eyes, but inconvenient in the highest degree. Lying down, for example, was an impossibility. One hung oneself up at night. As it was late when I turned in, I hadn't gotten the proper sleep when my young guardian awoke me by bringing breakfast into the cell. Now I understood better the trouble they went to on my account, for the brethren themselves ate nothing, and as for the water, they were probably battery-powered and needed distilled, but even so a few drops would hold them for the day, while in order to provide for me, they had to venture out into the furniture grove. The dish this time was a well-prepared armrest. If I say well-prepared, it isn't that it tasted good, but while eating, I now made allowances for all the circumstances accompanying that culinary endeavor. Still under the strong impression of last night's raid, I was unable to connect it with what I had read so far in the history book. Therefore, immediately after breakfast, I returned to my studies. From the very beginning of auto-evolution, the camp of progressive anatomy was torn by sharp differences of opinion on basic issues. Conservative opposition had vanished a mere 40 years after the moment of the great discovery. Conservatives were now considered gloomy reactionaries. The progressives, meanwhile, had divided into the overnighters, the step-at-a-timers, the changelings, transmutes, effluvians, and many other parties whose names and platforms I cannot recall. The overnighters wanted the government to decide on a perfect anatomical prototype and put it into law at once. The step-at-a-timers, more critically inclined, felt that perfection could not be achieved in one fell swoop, and therefore favored a deliberate approach to the ideal body, though it was not at all clear what course that approach ought to take. And above all, could it be, for the intervening generations, disagreeable? On this point they split into two factions. Others, like the transmutes and the changelings, maintained that there was merit in looking different for different occasions, and also that man was no worse than the insects. If they could undergo several metamorphoses in a single lifetime, then why not he? A child, an adolescent, a young man, an older man, could all personify fundamentally distinct designs. And as for the effluvians, they were the radicals. Condemning the skeleton as hopelessly outmoded, they called for an end to all vertebrae, and endorsed complete plasticity. An effluvian could physically shape or unshape himself at will. This was certainly practical in crowds, and also with regard to ready-made clothing of different sizes. Some of them kneaded and rolled themselves out into the peculiar forms, wishing to express, according to the situation and particular mood, their self-enmembered selves. Their opponents in the body politic contemptuously referred to them as blobsters. To meet the threat of anatomical anarchy, Sapsaplabd was brought into being, the Soma and Psyche Planning Board, whose job it was to put on the market a wide assortment, but all laboratory-tested, of transformational patterns. Yet still there was no agreement as far as the general direction of auto-evolution went. Should they make bodies in which life could be lived with the maximum pleasure, or bodies to facilitate the individual's full involvement in the social milieu? Should they strive for functionalism, or for aesthetic effect, enlarge the mind, or the muscles? It was fine to talk in generalities about harmony and perfection. At the same time, experience showed that not all desirable qualities went together. Quite a few of them were mutually exclusive. In any case, the break with natural man remained in force. The experts tried to outdo each other in proving the primitiveness, the utter shoddiness of nature's handiwork. The analytical morphometry, as well as the physiophysics of the day, revealed in his literature the clear influence of Donderwarg's doctrine. The unreliability of the natural body, its relentless movement towards senescence and death, the tyranny of ancient drives over the late-arriving reason. All this was subjected to scathing criticism, and the press waxed indignant over fallen arches, tumors, slipped discs, and 1,000 other afflictions caused by evolution's bungling and incompetence, which was called the underhanded work of wasteful, unprincipled, self-defeating heredity and its blind accomplice, natural selection. Modern descendants appeared to be taking revenge on nature for the dismal silence with which their forefathers had had to swallow the news that Dicoticans descended from the apes. They jeered at the so-called arboreal period, the fact that first some animals had started hiding out in trees, and later, when the forests gave way before the steppes, they had to come back down too soon. According to some critics, it was earthquakes that initiated anthropogenesis, making them all jump from their branches. In other words, the first people were shaken out of trees like rotten fruit. Gross oversimplifications, of course, but then ridiculing evolution was the thing to do. Meanwhile, Sopsiplabd had perfected the internal organs, put shock absorbers on the backbone, fortified it too, attached spare hearts, kidneys, but this didn't satisfy the extremists, who came forward with such demagogic slogans as "off with the head," too small for them, "brain in the belly," more room there, etc. The most violent disputes had to do with sexuality, for while some thought that all that was highly distasteful and one ought to borrow here from the flowers and butterflies, others, pooh-poohing the hypocrisy of the Platonists, demanded precisely the amplification and escalation of that which already was. Under pressure from radical groups, Sopsiplabd set up suggestion boxes in towns and villages. Proposals came flooding in, the administrative staff expanded exponentially, and in a decade bureaucracy had brought self-creativity to such a pass that Sopsiplabd was split up into associations and then into agencies like the Office of Orifices, the Lip Administration, LA, the Beautiful Figure Foundation, BUFF, the National Institute of Fingers and Toes, NIFTY, and many, many others. There were countless conferences and seminars on the question of extremities, on the future of the nose, the prospects for the sacroiliac, everyone losing sight of the totality, till finally what one section came up with didn't fit in with what the others had been doing. And no one now could keep abreast of the new problem, abbreviated GAD, Galloping Automorphic Deviation. So in order to put an end to all the confusion, they turned the whole biotic operation over to the digital Sopsiputer. With this concluded the second volume of the general history. As I was reaching for the next, into my cell came the novice to invite me to lunch. I hesitated to eat in the presence of the Father Prior, for now I knew just what a courtesy that was on his part, and what a waste of precious time. The invitation, however, was so pressing that I went at once. In the small refectory, alongside Father Darg, who was already waiting at the table, there stood a low cart, similar to the kind we use to carry luggage. This was Father Mimnar, General of the Order of the Prognosticants. I phrased that badly. It wasn't the cart, naturally, which was the priest and general of the order, but the cubic computer resting on its undercarriage. I don't believe I showed any rudeness by staring, neither was I at a loss for words during the introduction. Eating was awkward, but my organism required it. To help put me at my ease, the kindly prior drank water in tiny sips throughout the meal, and out of 2 crystal flagons at the same time. Father Mimnar, meanwhile, muttered softly to himself. Prayers, I thought, but when the conversation came round to theology once more, it turned out I was wrong. "I believe," Father Mimnar said to me, "and if my belief has basis, the one in whom I believe surely knows this, in the absence of my official declarations. The mind has fashioned for itself in history many different models of God, holding each in turn to be the one and only truth, but this is a mistake, for modeling meets codification, and a mystery codified ceases to be a mystery. The dogmas seem eternal only at the beginning of the stretching road of civilization. First they imagine God as the angry father, then as the shepherd gardener, then as the artist enamored of his creation. Therefore people had to play the respective roles of well-behaved children, obedient sheep, and finally that of enthralled audience. But it is infantile to think that God created in order that his creation bow and scrape from morning till night, in order that he be loved in advance installments for what will come yonder, if here happens not to be to one's liking, as though he were a virtuoso, and in exchange for repeated rounds of prayerful cheering prepared eternal encores to follow the terrestrial performance. In other words, saving his best number for the falling of the mortal curtain. That theatrical version of Theodicy belongs to our dim and distant past. If God has omniscience, then he knows everything there is to know about me, and knew it, moreover, for a time immeasurably long, before I came forth out of oblivion. He knows also what he will decide regarding my, or your, fears and expectations, for he is no less perfectly informed about all his own future actions. Otherwise he would not be omniscient. For him, no difference exists between the thought of a caveman and that of an intelligence which engineers will build 1 billion years from now, in a place where today is nothing but lava and flame. Nor do I see why the external circumstances of a profession of faith should make much difference to him, or, for that matter, whether it is homage someone offers or a grudge. We do not consider him a manufacturer who waits for approbation from his product, since history has brought us to the point where thought genuinely natural in no way differs from thought artificially induced, which means that there is no distinction whatever between natural and artificial. That now lies behind us. You must remember that we can create beings and mentalities of any kind. We could, for example, give rise to creatures that derive mystic ecstasy from existence. We could do it through crystallization, cloning, or in 100 other ways. And eventually, in their adorations directed at the transcendental, there would materialize a purpose characteristic of bygone prayer and worship. But this mass production of believers would be for us a pointless mockery. Remember, we do not beat our heads against the wall of any physical or inborn limitation to our desires. Such walls we have torn down, and have stepped out into the realm of absolute creative freedom. Today, a child can resurrect the dead, breathe life into the dust, into metal, destroy and kindle suns, for such technologies exist. The fact that not everyone has access to them is, as I think you will agree, unimportant from the theological point of view. Because the bounds of human agency, marked off with such precision in the Holy Book, have been attained unto and thereby violated. And the cruelty of the old restrictions is now replaced by the cruelty of their total absence. Yet we do not believe that the Creator hides his love from us behind the mask of both these alternative torments, putting us through the mill, as it were, in order to keep us guessing. Nor is it the Church's office to call both misfortunes, the bondage and the freedom, promissory notes, endorsed by revelation, and to be paid with interest by the heavenly treasurer. The vision of heaven as a bank account and hell as a debtor's prison represents a momentary aberration in the history of the faith. Theodicy is not a course in sophistry to train defenders of the good Lord, and faith doesn't mean telling people that everything will work out in the end. The Church changes, the faith changes, for both reside in history. One must therefore anticipate, and that is the task of our order. These words confounded me. I asked how the duistic religion reconciled what was happening on the planet, nothing good presumably, though I didn't as yet know what, having gotten no further than the 26th century in my reading, with the sacred writings, of which I was also ignorant. To this Father Memnar said, while the prior kept silent, "Faith is, at one and the same time, absolutely necessary and altogether impossible. Impossible to fix once and for all, there being no dogma a mind can latch onto with a certainty of permanence. We defended the Holy Writ for 25 centuries, using tactical retreats, circuitous interpretations of the text, until we were defeated. No longer do we have the bookkeeper's vision of the transcendental. God is neither the tyrant, nor the shepherd, nor the artist, nor the policeman, nor the head accountant of existence. Belief in God has had to cast off every selfish motive, if only by virtue of the fact that it will never, not anywhere, be rewarded. If God were to prove capable of acting contrary to logic and reason, that would be a sad surprise indeed. Was it not He, for who else, that gave us these logical forms of thought, without which we would know nothing? How then can we accept the notion that an act of faith requires the surrender of the logical mind? Why give us first the faculty of reason, only to do it violence by setting contradictions in its path? In order to mystify and make obscure, to lead us first to the conclusion that there is nothing later on, then pull heaven out of a hat like some common magician? We hardly think so. Which is why we ask no favors of God in consideration of the faith we hold. We present him with no demands, for we are finished and done with that theodicy based on the model of commercial transactions and payment in kind. I shall give thee being, thou shalt serve and praise me. In that case, I asked with more and more insistence, just what exactly do you monks and theologians do? How do you relate to God when, if I understand you correctly, you preserve neither dogma, nor ritual, nor devotions? In having truly nothing, replied the general of the prognosticants, we have everything. Be so good, dear stranger, as to read the other volumes of our Dichotican history, and you will learn just what it means to gain complete freedom in the realm of bodily and mental contrivance, made possible by both biotic revolutions. Now I consider it highly likely that deep within you find this spectacle amusing, that beings, flesh and blood like yourself, in acquiring ultimate control over their own selves, have by the very fact that they can now take faith and turn it on and off inside them like a light bulb, lost that faith. A faith which meanwhile was taken over from them by their instruments, thinking instruments, for such were needed at a certain stage of industrialization. Today, however, we are obsolete, and yet it is we, useless metal in the eyes of those that live upstairs, who believe. They tolerate us, having more important matters on their bowel sacks, and the government permits us everything that is, except our faith. That's strange, I said. You're not allowed to believe? Why? It's quite simple. Belief is the only thing that cannot be taken from a conscious entity, so long as that entity consciously cleaves to it. The authorities could not only crush us, they could reprogram us completely out of our belief. They do not do this, I am sure, through contempt or else indifference. It is mastery that they want, pure and simple, and any gap in that mastery must represent to them its diminution. Therefore we keep our faith concealed. You asked of its nature. It is, one might say, completely naked, this faith of ours, and completely defenseless. We entertain no hopes, make no demands, requests, we count on nothing, we only believe. Put no more questions to me then, but give some thought instead to what a faith like mine must mean. If someone believes for certain reasons and on certain grounds, his faith loses its full sovereignty. That 2 and 2 are 4 I know right well, and therefore need not have faith in it. But of God I know nothing, and therefore can only have faith. What does this faith give me? By the ancient reckoning, not a blessed thing. No longer is it the anodyne for the dread of extinction. No longer the heavenly courtier lobbying for salvation and against damnation. It does not allay the mind, tormented by the contradictions of existence. It does not smooth out those edges. I tell you, it is worthless, which means it serves no end. We cannot even declare that this is the reason we believe, because such faith reduces to absurdity. He who would speak thus is in effect claiming to know the difference, permanently, between the absurd and the not absurd, and has himself chosen the absurd, because according to him that is the side on which God stands. We do not argue thus. Our act of faith is neither supplicating nor thankful, neither humble nor defiant. It simply is, and there is nothing more that can be said about it. Much impressed by what I had heard, I returned to my cell and to my reading, the 3rd volume now of Dichotican history. It described the era of transcarnal centralization. The Sopsiputer at first worked to everyone's satisfaction, but then new beings began appearing on the planet, bibods, tribods, quadribods, then octobods, and finally those that had no intention whatever of ending in an innumerable way, for in the course of a life they were constantly sprouting something new. This was the result of a defect, a faulty reiteration recursion in the program, or, to put it in layman's terms, the machine had started stuttering. Since, however, the cult of its perfection was in full sway, people actually praised these automorphic deviations, asserting, for example, that all that incessant budding and branching out was in fact the true expression of man's protean nature. And this praise not only held up the repairs, but led to the rise of so-called indeterminates, or entites, capital N, tights, who lost their way in their own body. There was so much of it. Completely baffled, they would get themselves into so-called bind-ups, entangulums, and snorrels. Often an ambulance squad was needed to untie them. The repair of the Sopsiputer didn't work. Named the Oopsiputer, it was finally blown sky-high. The feeling of relief that followed didn't last long, however, for the accursed question soon returned. What to do about the body now? It was then, for the first time, that timid voices made themselves heard. Oughtn't we go back to the old look? But that suggestion was branded as obscurantist, medieval. In the elections of 2520, the damn wells and the relativists came out on top, because their demagogic line caught on, to wit, that every man should look as he damn well pleased. Limitations on looks would be functional only. The district bodybuilding examiner approved designs that were existence-worthy, without concern for anything else. These designs, Sopsiplabbed threw on the market in droves. Historians call the period of automorphosis under the Sopsiputer the age of centralization, and the years that followed, re-impersonalizationalism. The turning over of individual looks to private initiative led, after several decades, to a new crisis. True, a few philosophers had already come forward with the notion that the greater the progress, the more the crises, and that in the absence of crises one ought to produce them, because they activated, integrated, aroused the creative impulse, the lust for battle, and gave both spiritual and material energies direction. In a word, crises spurred societies to concerted action, and without them you had stagnation, decadence, and other symptoms of decay. these views were voiced by the school of optimists, that is, philosophers who derived optimism for the future from a pessimistic appraisal of the present. The period of private initiative in bodybuilding lasted 3/4 of a century. At first, there was much enjoyment taken in the newly won freedom of automorphists. Once again, the young people led the way, the men with their gambrel fills and timbrels, the women with their pinafores, but before long a generation gap developed, and demonstrations, under the banner of asceticism, followed. The sons condemned their fathers for being interested only in making a living, for having a passive, often consumerist attitude towards the body, for their shallow hedonism, their vulgar pursuit of pleasure, and in order to disassociate themselves, they assumed shapes deliberately hideous, uncomfortable beyond belief, downright nightmarish, the antleroons, womp-doodles. Showing their contempt for all things utilitarian, they set eyes in their armpits, and one group of young biotic activists made use of innumerable sound organs, specially grown, glottophones, hawkpipes, knuckelodians, thumbolas. They arranged mass concerts in which the soloists, called hoot howls, would whip up the crowd into a frenzy of convulsive percussion. Then came the fashion, the mania rather, for long tentacles, which in caliber and strength of grip underwent escalation according to the typically adolescent swaggering principle of, you haven't seen anything yet. And since no one could lift those piles of coils by himself, so-called processionals were attached. Cordelettes, a self-perambulating receptacle that grew out of the small of the back and carried on 2 strong shanks the weight of the tentacles after their owner. In the textbook I found illustrations depicting men of fashion, behind whom walked tentacle-bearing processionals on parade. But this was already the decline of the protest movement, or more precisely its complete bankruptcy, because it had failed to pursue any goals of its own, being solely a rebellious reaction against the orgiastic Baroque of the age. This Baroque had its apologists and theoreticians, who maintained that the body existed for the purpose of deriving the greatest amount of pleasure from the greatest number of sights simultaneously. Merg Burb, its leading exponent, argued that nature had situated, and stingily at that, centers of pleasurable sensation in the body for the purpose of survival only. Therefore, no enjoyable experience was, by her decree, autonomous, but always served some end. The supplying of the organism with fluids, for example, or with carbohydrates or proteins, or the guaranteeing, through offspring, of the continuation of the species, etc. From this imposed pragmatism, it was necessary to break away, totally. The passivity displayed up till now in bodily design was due to a lack of imagination and perspective. Epicurean or erotic delight, all a paltry byproduct in the satisfying of instinctive needs, in other words, the tyranny of nature. It wasn't enough to liberate sex, proof of that was ectogenesis, for sex had little future in it, from the combinatorial as well as from the constructional standpoint. Whatever there was to think up in that department had long ago been done, and the point of automorphic freedom didn't lie in simple-mindedly enlarging this or that, producing inflated imitations of the same old thing. No, we had to come up with completely new organs and members whose sole function would be to make their possessor feel good, feel great, feel better all the time. Burb received the enthusiastic support of a group of talented young designers from Sopsoplabd, who invented brippets and gnouls. These were announced with great fanfare in ads which promised that the old pleasures of the palate and bedroom would be like picking one's nose in comparison with bripping and gnouling. Ecstasy centers, of course, were implanted in the brain, programmed specially by nerve path engineers, and hooked up, moreover, in series. Thus were created the brippive and gnoulial drives, also activities corresponding to those instincts, activities with a highly rich and varied range, for one could gnoul and brip alternately or at the same time, alone, in pairs, trios, and later, after novels were tacked on, in groups of several dozen individuals as well. Also new forms of art came into being. Master brippers appeared, and gnoul artists, but that was only the beginning. Towards the end of the 26th century, you had the mannerism of the march pusses. The muckledong was a tremendous hit, and the celebrated Onder Sturt, who could simultaneously gnoul, brip, and postulate while flying through the air on spinal wings, became the idol of millions. At the height of the Baroque, sex went out of style. Only 2 small parties kept it going, the integrationalists and the separatists. The separatists, averse to all debauchery, felt that it was improper to eat sauerkraut with the same mouth one used to kiss one's sweetheart. For this a separate, platonic mouth was needed, and better yet, a complete set of them, variously designated, for relatives, for friends, and for that special person. The integrationalists, valuing utility above all else, worked in reverse, combining whatever was combinable to simplify the organism and life. The decline of the Baroque, typically tending to the extravagant and the grotesque, produced such curious forms as the stool maid and the hexus, which resembled a centaur, except that instead of hooves, it had 4 bare feet, with the toes all facing one another. They also called it a syncopant, after a dance in which energetic stamping was the basic step. But the market now was glutted, exhausted. It was hard to come up with a startling new body. People used their natural horns for ear flaps. Flap ears, diaphanous and with stigmatic scenes, fanned with their pale pinkness the cheeks of ladies of distinction. There were attempts to walk on supple pseudopodia. Meanwhile, Sopsoplabd, out of sheer inertia, made more and more designs available, though everyone felt that all of this was drawing to a close. Engrossed in my reading, with books scattered all about, and in the light of lamps that were crawling across the ceiling overhead, I fell asleep without realizing it. I was awakened only by the distant sound of the morning bell. Immediately my novice appeared, to ask if I might care for a change of scenery. If so, the prior invited me to join him on a tour of inspection of the entire diocese, at the side of Father Memner. I accepted. The prospect of leaving these gloomy catacombs delighted me. Unfortunately, the outing turned out differently than I imagined. We didn't go up on the surface at all. The monks, having outfitted for the trip some short pack animals covered with floor-length claws as gray as the monastic frocks, sat upon them bareback, and off we went, shuffling slowly down the subterranean corridor. These were, as I had earlier guessed, part of a sewer system, unused for centuries by the metropolis that soared above us in 1,000 half-ruined edifices. The measured gait of my mount had something strange about it, nor could I discern beneath its coverlet any indication of a head. Discreetly lifting a corner of the canvas, I saw that the thing was a machine, a 4-footed robot of some sort, extremely primitive. By noon we had traveled less than 20 miles, though it was hard to gauge the distance covered, since the way twisted through a labyrinth of sewers, dimly lit by bulbs that sometimes fluttered in a small flock above us, and sometimes, glancing off the concave ceiling, hurried to the head of the column, where they were being whistled for. We arrived finally at the abode of the prognosticant friars, where we were received with honor. I, in particular, became the object of much attention. Since the furniture grove was now quite far, the good prognosticants had to go to special trouble to prepare, with me in mind, a decent meal. This was provided by the stores of the deserted metropolis, in the form of packets of seeds. 2 bowls were placed before me, one empty, the other full of water, and for the first time I was able to see the products of a biotic civilization in action. The friars apologized profusely for the lack of soup. The monk they'd sent to the surface by way of a well shaft had simply been unable to find the right package. However, the cutlet turned out fine. The seed, with a few spoonfuls of water poured over it, expanded, flattened out, and in less than a minute I had on my plate a deliciously browned slice of veal, all in butter, which sizzled as it oozed from the pores of the meat. The store this tidbit came from must have been in total disarray, seeing as how in among the packets with gastronomic seeds others had gotten mixed. Instead of dessert, what took shape on my plate was a tape recorder, and a useless one at that, because on its reels it had suspenders. It was explained to me that this sort of hybridization had become fairly common of late, since the vending machines, unsupervised, were turning out seeds of poorer and poorer quality. Those biotic products can cross-breed, and that is precisely how one gets such freakish combinations. So then, finally, I had learned the origin of the wild furniture. The worthy friars wanted to send one of the younger novices back up into the ruins of the city for my dessert, but I objected strongly. I was far more interested in conversation than in dessert. Their refectory, once a great purification plant for the city sewers, appeared to be spotlessly clean, strewn with white sand, lit up with numerous bulbs, which were different here than at the demolitions, namely winking and striped, as if they derived from giant wasps. We sat at a long table, alternately, so that beside each demolition monk there rested the chassis of a prognosticant. For some reason I felt embarrassed to be the only one with face and hands exposed. There among the massed figures of the robot brothers, those coarse cowls with glass over the eye holes, and among the father computers, who, being rectangular, in no way resembled living creatures. A number of these were connected by electric cords beneath the table. However, I hadn't the courage to inquire why they needed this additional channel of communication. The conversation that developed during that solitary meal, for no one else was eating, turned once again, perforce, to transcendental things. I wished to know what the last believers of Diatica thought on the subject of good and evil, God and the devil. But when I posed this question, there was a long silence, during which only the striped light bulbs buzzed softly in the corners of the refectory, though this might have been, too, the current of the prognosticants. At last, an elderly computer sitting opposite me, a specialist in religious history, as I later learned from Father Dark, spoke up. "Getting straight to the point, I would put our views in the following way," he said. "Satan is that which we understand the least in God. This does not mean that we consider God himself to be an alloy of elements, of the high and the low, good and evil, love and hate, the power of creation and the lust for destruction. Satan is the idea that God can be delimited, classified, isolated, separated by fractional distillation until he becomes that, and only that, which we are able to accept and need no longer defend ourselves against. An idea which is untenable inside history because it leads inevitably to the conclusion that there is no knowledge but what derives from Satan, and that he will extend his influence until he has encompassed all that fosters knowledge in toto. And this because knowledge gradually nullifies the directives we call revealed commandments. It permits us to kill without killing, to destroy, but in such a way that the destruction is creative. It evaporates off those persons whom we are supposed to honor, the father and the mother, for example, and it does away with such dogmas as immaculate conception and the immortal soul. If these are the work of the devil, then everything you touch is the devil's work, nor can it even be said that Satan has engulfed all civilization, but the Church in it he is not engulfed, for the Church, albeit reluctantly, step by step consents to the acquisition of knowledge, and on that road there is no place where one can say, thus far and no farther, for no one, within the Church or without, can tell what the outcome of today's knowledge will be tomorrow. The Church may from time to time declare war upon that progress, but as she defends one front, say the sanctity of conception, progress, instead of making a frontal attack, executes an encircling maneuver, which obviates the sense of the defended position. 1,000 years ago, our Church defended motherhood, but knowledge obviated the very concept of a mother, first by cutting the act of maternity in two, then by removing it outside the body, then by performing embryosynthesis, so that after 3 centuries the defense had lost all meaning. The Church then had to accept remote control insemination and test tube conception and artificial birth and artificial intelligence and the ghost in the machine receiving the sacraments and the disappearance of every distinction between naturally created and man-made entities. Had the Church persisted in her opinion, eventually she would have been forced to admit that there is no God but Satan. To save God, we acknowledged the historicity of Satan, that is, his evolution as a projection, changing in time, of all those qualities which in creation both terrify and sadden us. Satan is the naive idea that one can differentiate between God and not God, as between day and night. God is mystery, while Satan represents the personed aggregate of the isolated constituents of that mystery. For us there is no Satan outside history. This is the one thing, constant in him and personified, which proceeds from freedom. However, you must, O guest and stranger from afar, forsake the categories of your thought, which have been shaped by a different history than ours, as you listen to my words. Freedom, to us, means something altogether different than it does to you. It means the collapse of all limitations on action, that is, the withering away of all the constraints life encounters at the dawn of intelligence. Those constraints form the mind, for they lift it up out of the vegetable abyss. And since those constraints are a terrible nuisance, the fondest dream of the historical mind is to achieve complete and total liberty, and that is why it is in this direction that civilization heads, step by step. There is the step of hewing urns of stone, and the step of raising the dead, and the step of extinguishing suns, and there are no insurmountable obstacles between these steps. The freedom I speak of, it is not that modest state desired by certain people when others oppress them. For then man becomes, for man, a set of bars, a wall, a snare, a pit. The freedom I have in mind lies farther out, extends beyond that societal zone of reciprocal throat-throttling, for that zone may be passed through safely, and then, in the search for new constraints, since people no longer impose these on each other, one finds them in the world and in oneself, and takes up arms against the world and against oneself, to contend with both, and make both subject to one's will. And when this, too, is done, a precipice of freedom opens up. For now, the more one has the power to accomplish, the less one knows what ought to be accomplished. At first, wisdom is tempting. But from a jug of water in the desert, it becomes like a jug of water in the middle of a lake, since wisdom, like water, is readily assimilable, and since you can bestow it upon scrap iron and frogs' eggs. Yet, however respectable the striving after my wisdom may appear, there are no respectable arguments for the flight from wisdom. No one then will say aloud that he desires to be stupid, and even if, so desiring, he has the courage of his convictions, to where exactly is he to retreat? No natural gap exists any longer between reason and unreason. For science has quantized and dissolved that gap. Therefore even a deserter from knowledge cannot evade his freedom, for he must choose the state that suits him best, and before him lie more possibilities than there are stars in the firmament. He who is terribly wise among those like himself becomes a caricature of wisdom, much as a queen bee becomes, without her hive, the caricature of a mother, no purpose being served by the heap of eggs bursting from her abdomen. We have, then, escapes from that position, furtive and in the greatest shame, or scrambling and in the greatest panic. There, where each must be as he is, one sticks it out of necessity. There, where each may be different than he is, one will fritter away his appointed time, leaping frantically from life to life. Such a society, seen from above, looks like a swarm of insects on a heated stove. At a distance its agony has the aspect of a farce, with those comical leaps from wisdom to stupidity, with the fruits of knowledge used so one can play his stomach like a drum, run on 100 legs, or paper a wall with his brain. When it is possible to duplicate the one you love, there is no more loved one. There is only the mockery of love. And when it is possible to become anyone at all and hold whatever convictions you like, then you are already no one and can hold no convictions. And so our history falls to the bottom and bounces up again, jumping like a puppet on a string, and that is why it seems so gruesomely amusing. Government regulates freedom, but in so doing imposes arbitrary limits, limits which rebellion will overthrow, for you cannot conceal what once has been discovered. Therefore, in saying that Satan is the embodiment of freedom, I mean that he represents that side of God's work which frightens us the most, a crossroads of countless continua, where we stand paralyzed by the attainment of our goal. According to one naive philosophy, the world ought to limit us, in the way that a straitjacket limits a madman, and another voice in that philosophy tells us that these fetters ought to reside within ourselves. He who says this yearns for the existence of restrictions on freedom, manifested either in the world or in himself, for he would have the world close certain roads to him, or else have his own nature restrain him thus. God, however, has given us neither the one nor the other sort of restriction. And not only that, but he ironed out the places where we had anticipated such restrictions, in order that we would not know, when crossing them, that this was precisely what we were doing. But did it not follow from this, I asked, that God was, according to the duistic faith, identical with Satan? I observed a slight agitation among those present. The historian was silent, but the general of the order said, "It is as you say, but not as you think. Saying God is Satan, you impart to those words a sense of the Creator's villainy. What you said, therefore, is false, but only because you said it. If I were to say it, or any of the brothers here, those words would have an altogether different meaning. They would mean merely that there are gifts of God we can accept without resistance, and gifts we are unable to assume. They would mean God has in no way, but in no way, limited us, curtailed us, confined us. And note, please, that a world compelled to good alone is as much a shrine to compulsion as a world compelled to evil only. Do you not agree with me, Dagdor?" The historian to whom this question was addressed concurred, and then said, "There are known to me as a chronicler of beliefs, theogonies, according to which God fashioned the world to be not entirely perfect, yet a world which, in a direct or zigzag path, or in a spiral, was heading towards perfection. And there are known to be doctrines according to which God is an enormous infant that has set its playthings going in the right direction for its own amusement. I also know teachings which call perfect that which already is. In order, however, to balance the books of that perfection, they throw in a correcting factor, and that factor bears the name of the devil. But the model of existence is a toy train with a perpetually self-winding spring of progress, which moves creation faster and faster to where things are always better, as well as the model of existence in which miraculous interventions are indispensable. In other words, creation is a broken watch, and miracle is God's tweezers probing its stellar works to make the necessary adjustments. Not to mention the model of the world is a delicious cake in which are embedded the fish bones of diabolical temptation. All these are taken from the primer of an intelligent race, that is, a picture book which adulthood places, with a twinge of nostalgia perhaps, but also with a shrug, back on the shelf of the child's room. There are no demons if you do not count the demon of freedom. The world is one, and God is one, and faith, too, is one, O stranger, and the rest is silence." I was going to ask what, then, according to them, were the positive qualities of God and the world, since so far I had heard only what God was not. And then, too, after this lecture on the eschatology of freedom, my head was all a spin and in confusion. But it was time for us to continue on our way. When we were already waddling on our iron steeds, as we rode along, I asked Father Darg, struck by a sudden thought, why exactly did his order have the name of demolition? "That has to do with the topic of our conversation at the table," he replied. "The name, of historical derivation, signifies the acceptance of existence in its entirety, an entirety originating with God, and including not only that which is in him creativeness, but also that which to us appears to be its opposite. It does not signify," he hastened to add, "that we ourselves are on the side of demolition. Indeed, no one today would give the order that name. It was the product of a certain theological grudge reflecting bygone crises of the Church." I was now squinting, for we had come to a place where the sewer, on account of cave-ins in the ceiling, here and there opened up onto the surface, and for a while I could not lift my eyelids, so unaccustomed was I to the sun. We were on a plain devoid of any sign of vegetation. The city had become a grey-blue edge of buildings on the horizon, and the whole expanse was crisscrossed with smooth, wide roads like ribbons of silvery metal. They were as empty as the sky above, where only a few puffy-white clouds could be seen drifting along. Our mounts, looking particularly misshapen on that high-speed road, slowly creaking, and as if blinded by the rays of the sun, to which they were not accustomed, followed a short cut known to the monks, but before we reached the concrete drain that led back down into the earth, there appeared between the arches of a viaduct a small building in emerald green and gold. This, I thought, was probably a gas station. Standing next to it was a flat vehicle, like a big roach, streamlined thus for speed. The building itself had no windows, only semi-translucent walls, through which the sun was shining as if through stained glass. When we were some 60 feet away, stretched out in one long column, I heard groans issuing from that place, and a throaty rattle so dreadful my hair stood on end. The voice, undeniably human, choked and moaned in turn. I knew for a certainty that this was the cry of someone being tortured, being murdered, perhaps. I looked at my companions, but they paid absolutely no attention to those grisly sounds. I wanted to shout to them, shout that we should go at once and help, but then I was speechless with dismay, that they could be that indifferent to the fate of a man undergoing torture. So I jumped from my iron animal and ran straight ahead, throwing all caution to the winds. But before I could make it to the building, a short, strangled scream rang out, followed by silence. The building was a pavilion, gracefully structured, with no apparent door. I ran around it in vain, then stopped, rooted to the spot before a wall of blue enamel, transparent to such a degree that I could see inside. There on a blood-spattered table lay a naked figure, surrounded by machines that had sunk gleaming tubes or tongs into its body, which was now dead, and so contorted by the final throes I couldn't tell arms from legs. Nor did I see the head, or whatever served for a head, locked inside a heavy metal bell that went down over and bristled with tiny spikes. The corpse no longer bled from its numerous wounds. The heart had ceased to beat. With my feet burning on the sun-baked sand and the horrible scream of the dichoticon still ringing in my ears, I stood, overcome by the horror, the ghastliness, the mystery of the scene, for the corpse was alone. I could look into all the corners of that mechanized torture chamber. I felt rather than heard the approach of a cowled figure, and, seeing out of the corner of my eye that it was the prior, I said in a ragged voice, "What is this? Who? What? Killed him?" He stood beside me like a statue, and suddenly I was struck dumb by the realization that he was, in fact, a statue of iron. Beneath the earth, the masked monks in their pointed cowls had not appeared so alien as they did now in the full sunlight, amid the white geometry of the roads, under the open sky. There, behind a wall of glass, that twisted body in the grip of metal seemed the only thing near and dear to me, while I stood terribly alone in the midst of cold, logical machines that were capable only of abstract reasoning. I was seized by the desire, more, the determination, to leave without another word, without even looking in their direction, for in that single moment an impassable gulf had opened up between them and myself. Yet still I stood, beside the prior, who was silent as if waiting for something more. In the chamber, flooded with blue light filtering through the glass of the ceiling and walls, something twitched. The sparkling arms of the mechanisms above the stiffened corpse began to move. Carefully they straightened the victim's limbs, cleaned his wounds with a fluid clear as water, though steaming while it washed away the blood. And now he lay stretched out, as if composed for the sleep eternal. But knives gleamed, and the thought flashed through me that they were going to dissect him. Although he was already dead, I wanted to run and save him from being cut into pieces, but the prior placed an iron hand on my shoulder, and I didn't move. The shining bell lifted, and I beheld a face, an inhuman face. By now all the machines were working at once, and so rapidly that I saw only a blur and the motion of a glass pump beneath the table, inside which a red liquid churned, till finally, in the middle of this confusion, the chest of the corpse began to rise and fall. Before my eyes, his wounds sealed up. He twitched all over. He yawned. "He's come back to life?" I asked in a whisper. "Yes," said the prior, "in order to die once more." The one lying flat looked around, and with a limp, seemingly boneless palm, gripped the handle that stuck out on the side, gave a pull, and the bell slid back over his head. The slanting pincers, emerging from their sheaths, clutched the body, and a scream rang out, the same scream as before. So confounded was I now that I let myself be led without resisting to the patiently waiting caravan of masked robots. In a kind of trance, I clambered back up on my mount and listened to the words addressed to me. It was the prior explaining that the pavilion was a special service station where one could live and relive one's own death. The purpose here is to experience sensations as powerful as possible, and not necessarily suffering, for with the aid of stimuli transformers, pain becomes an excruciating pleasure. All this derives from the fact that thanks to certain types of automorphists, dichoticans can enjoy even the pangs of death, and those for whom once is not enough can, upon resurrection, have themselves re-murdered, that they may experience that awful thrill again. And in fact, our iron caravan moved away from that place of self-service execution slowly enough for the groans and shrieks of the connoisseur of strong emotions to reach us long afterwards. This particular method bears the name of agonism. It is one thing to read of bloody maelstroms in a history text, another entirely to see with your own eyes, to experience even a tiny fragment of them. I was sick of our sojourn on the surface, beneath the sun, with the silver arcs of highways all around, and the pavilion shimmering in the distance behind us filled me with such horror that it was with genuine relief that I descended into the gloom of the sewer, which received us with a cool and sheltering silence. The prior, divining my troubled state of mind, said nothing. Toward evening we visited the hermitage of an anchorite, also the order of some friars minor who had taken up residence in the filtration plant of an outlying district, till finally, having completed our circuit of the diocese, we returned to the dwelling of the demolition friars, in whose presence I felt a strange embarrassment for that brief moment in which I had conceived such fear and loathing of them. The little cell seemed like home to me. Already waiting was a portion of cold stuffed drawer, prepared by my thoughtful novice. Wolfing it down, for I was hungry, I opened the volume of Dichotic and History that dealt with modern times. Chapter 1 spoke of the autopsychic trends of the 29th century. The ennui with transmutability was by then so great that the idea of turning away from the body and engaging in mind formation seemed to instill new life into society and rouse it from its indolence. Thus began the Renaissance. The Wisdomites led the way, with their plan of turning everyone alive into a genius. This soon awakened a great thirst for knowledge, intensive activity in the sciences, the establishment of interstellar contact with other civilizations. But the information explosion necessitated further biological alterations, since the educated brain wouldn't fit now even in the abdomen. Society enwisdomized itself hyperbolically, and waves of braininess swept the planet. This Renaissance, finding the purpose of life in cogitation and cognition, lasted about 70 years. There were no end of great minds, masterminds, hyperminds, and finally, counterminds and underminds. And since moving a high-powered brain around on a processional grew more and more cumbersome, after the passing phase of the double-thinkers, these had 2 bodily wheelbarrows, fore and aft, for thoughts highbrow and low, life itself rendered the Wisdomites immobile. Each sat in the tower of his own intelligence, wrapped in snaking cables like a gorgon. Society grew to resemble a vast honeycomb of wisdom, in which the living human larva lay imprisoned. People communicated by radio and paid televisits to one another. Subsequent escalation led to conflict between those that advocated the pooling of individual stores of knowledge and the hoarders of wisdom who wanted to own every scrap of information for themselves. The thoughts of others began to be tapped. Brilliant ideas were intercepted. Soon you had the towers of opponents in philosophy and the arts undermined, data falsified, wires cut, and there were even attempts to expropriate the psychic possessions of others along with the identity of their owner. The reaction, when it came, was violent. Our medieval woodcuts, offering representations of dragons and monstrosities from other lands, are child's play alongside the physical abandonment that then beset the globe. The last Wisdomites, half blinded by the sun, crawled out from under the ruins and left the cities. In the resulting chaos, whippersnappers, pedorants, and spotted thuglies stalked the land. There arose units of flesh and metal, adept at fornication, the collops, canards, pessaries, and glyphs, and outrageous caricatures of the clergy sprang up, nuncs and nunnesses, not to mention the catenary and the scroffle. This was also when agonism came into vogue. Civilization retrogressed. Hordes of muscular throts in rut went crashing through the forest with tractor dryads. In secluded hollow logs lurked flukes. There was nothing on the planet now to indicate that once it had been the cradle of anthropoid intelligence. In the parks all overgrown with table weeds and wild china, there lay basking between clumps of gnatkill hullocks, veritable mountains of breathing meat. The majority of these monstrous forms did not arise through conscious choice and planning, but rather were the ghastly consequence of breakdowns in the bodybuilding machinery. It produced not what had been ordered, but degenerate and crippled freaks. In this period of social teratolysis, as Professor Groggs writes, prehistory seems to have taken astonishing revenge on the future, for that which the primitive mind had only imagined, peopling its myths with nightmares. That unearthly, hair-raising word was, by the biotic machinery run out of control, made flesh. At the beginning of the 30th century, the dictator Dzamber Glauben assumed control of the planet, and in the course of the next 20 years introduced physical unification, normalization, and standardization, held then to be the means of salvation. He was an enlightened despot of humanitarian principles, therefore did not permit the extermination of the degenerated forms of 29th century vintage, but had them herded into special reservations. It was, incidentally, precisely at the edge of one of these reservations, beneath the rubble of an ancient provincial capital, that the subterranean monastery of the Demolition Friars, where I had taken refuge, had ensconced itself. At D. Glauben's behest, every citizen was to be a hindless she-male, that is, a sexually neutral individual that would have the same appearance coming and going. Dzamber wrote My Thoughts, a work in which he set forth his whole program. He deprived humanity of contrasting gender, for he saw in it the cause of the decline of the preceding century. The centers of pleasure he let his subjects keep, when they were socialized. He also let them keep their reason, not wishing to reign over idiots, but be instead a reviver of civilization. But reason means variety, and so includes unorthodox ideas. The opposition, outlawed, went underground, and abandoned itself to cheerless anti-femasculine orgies, or so at least said the official press. Glauben, however, did not persecute the dissenters, who took on protest shapes, lumplings, rumpists. Reportedly there were also double rumpists active in the underground, who claimed that reason was only for realizing that reason ought to be disposed of, and quickly, too, seeing as it was the cause of all the calamities in history. The head they replaced with what we think of as its opposite. They considered it encumbering, harmful, old hat. But Father Darg assured me that the official press had overstated the case. The rumpists didn't like the head, so they discarded it, but the brain they merely moved lower, letting it look out at the world through an umbilical eye. The other was positioned in the back, a little farther down. Glauben announced, having brought about some semblance of order, a plan for the millennial stabilization of society with the aid of hedalgetics. Its introduction was preceded by a great campaign in the press under the slogan of Sex in the Service of Labor. Each citizen was assigned a particular job, and the nerve path engineers hooked up the neurons of his brain in such a way that he experienced pleasure only when he worked diligently and with a will. So whether someone planted trees or carried water, he wallowed in bliss, and the better he worked, the more intense his ecstasy became. But that perversity so typical of intelligence cut the ground from under this foolproof, one would have thought, socio-technological method as well. For nonconformists considered the pleasure experienced at work to be a form of compulsion. Resisting the lust for work, the laborabidinal urge, despite the sensual desires that pulled them irresistibly to their appointed tasks, they did not that to which their appetite inclined them, but exactly the reverse. The water-carrier chopped wood, the woodcutter hauled water, demonstrating in this way against the government. The intensification of the socialized sex drives, carried out several times at Glauben's command, produced no effect, except that the historians call these years of his reign the Age of the Martyrs. The Biolese had great difficulty identifying the offenders, for those caught red-handed in torment would dissemble, claiming they had been groaning out of pleasure. Glauben withdrew from the arena of biotic life deeply disillusioned, for his great plan lay in ruins. Then at the turn of the 31st and 32nd centuries, you had the wars between the diadocs. The planet split up into provinces, each inhabited by citizens shaped according to the wishes of the local government. This was already the time of the post-teratolytical counter-reformation. From the many centuries there remained conglomerates of half-demolished cities, fetal factories, reservations only sporadically supervised by air, abandoned sex stadiums and other relics of the past, sometimes still functioning in a half-hearted way. Tetradox Glambron instituted censorship of the genetic codes, proclaiming certain genes forbidden, but uncensored persons either managed to bribe the inspection officials or else use masks in public places, makeup, taping their tails between their shoulders, slipping them furtively down their pant legs, etc. These practices were an open secret. Pentadox Marmazel, operating on the principle of divide et impera, increased by law the number of officially recognized sexes. During his rule, in addition to the male and female, there were introduced the hype, the syncarp, and two auxiliary sexes, fronts and fossicles. Life, especially one's sex life, became in the reign of this pentadox quite complicated. Moreover, secret organizations, when holding their meetings, did so under the guise of government-approved, six-person, sexy-sexual intercourse. Consequently, the project was dropped, at least in part. Today, only the hype and syncarp still exist. Under the hexadoxies, physical illusions came into use. These enabled one to get around the chromosomal censor. I saw sketches of people whose earlobes extended into little calves. It was impossible to tell whether such a person was merely perking up his ears or making an allusion to the act of kicking. In certain circles, tongues ending in miniature hooves were highly prized. True, the hoof was uncomfortable and served no real purpose, yet this was precisely how the spirit of somatic independence manifested itself. Guril Hapsador, who passed for a liberal, permitted citizens of extraordinary merit to own an additional leg. It was taken as a mark of distinction, but later on the leg, losing its locomotive character, became a badge of the rank one held. High officials had up to 9 legs. Thanks to this, it was now possible to recognize any person's standing immediately, even in the public bath. Under the stern rule of Ronder Ischiolis, a stop was put to this granting of supplementary living footage, and legs were even confiscated from people found guilty of infractions. He apparently intended to do away with all extremities and organs, save those indispensable for life, and also to introduce micro-miniaturization, for smaller and smaller homes were being built. But Bezugas Thumna, who assumed power after Ischiolis, rescinded these directives and even allowed the tail, under the pretext that with its tassel one could sweep one's dwelling. Then, in the reign of Gondal Gwana, you had the so-called back-wing deviationalists, who augmented their extremities illegally, and in the next phase of repressive regimes there appeared again, or rather were concealed, tongue-nails and other protest organelles. Oscillations of this type were still going on when I arrived at Diatica. Things which one would never be allowed to realize in the flesh found expression in porno-biotic literature, underground writings which numbered among the many forbidden books contained here in the monastic library. I leafed through, for example, a manifesto calling for a vampook, which was supposed to walk about on its hair. Also the creation of another anonymous author, a thapostulary, which would float through the air like a blimp. Having thus formed a rough idea of the planet's history, I acquainted myself with its current scientific literature. The primary research and development agency now is Coprosops, commissioned for the coordination of projects Re, Soma, and Psyche. The brother librarian was kind enough to let me look at the most recent publications of this agency. Thus, for example, body engineer Dergard Nonk is the originator of a prototype bearing the temporary name of Poliminoid, or Scattermind. Professor Dr. Senior Engineer Deband Rabor, who heads a large research team, is working on a bold, even controversial design for what he calls an omnius. This is to be a functional system of channels operative in 3 respects: communicational, navigational, and official. I was also able to familiarize myself with the projective futurological works of dichotican body experts. I came away with the impression that automorphists, as a whole, had reached a dead end in its development, though the specialists in the field were trying to overcome stagnation. An article by Professor Gagbert Grautz, director of Coprosops, in the monthly Body Illustrated, concluded with the words, "How can one not transform oneself when one can?" After all this arduous studying, I was so exhausted that upon returning the last pile of books to the library, I did nothing for an entire week but sun myself in the furniture grove. I asked the prior what he thought of the biotic situation. In his opinion, a return to human forms was no longer possible for the dichoticans. They had strayed too far from them. These forms aroused, due to many centuries of indoctrination, such prejudices and such general revulsion that even they, the robots, were obliged, when appearing in public places, to cover themselves completely, every inch. I asked him then, we were alone in the refectory after dinner, what sense there was within this sort of civilization to monastic work and faith. The prior smiled at me with his voice. "Yes, I was expecting that question," he said, "and shall give you 2 answers to it, one vulgar and one more subtle. Duism, first, amounts to 6 of one, half dozen the other. For God is so deep a mystery that one can have no certainty even as to the question of his existence, and therefore either he is or he is not. From this derives the etymological root of the name of our religion. And now a second time, but more profoundly. God's certainty is not a perfect mystery, seeing that one can pin him down and limit him totally in this respect at least, that he exists. The guarantee of his existence represents an oasis, a place of rest, an easy chair for the spirit, and it is precisely in volumes of religious history that you will find, above all else, a constant, age-old, desperate, all-out effort of the mind, bordering on insanity, to accumulate arguments and proofs for his existence. And when those inevitably crumble, to take the bits and chips and raise them up anew. We did not burden you with the relating of our theological tomes, but if you looked in them, you would discern those subsequent stages in the natural development of faith that are as yet unknown to younger civilizations. The phase of dogma does not break off suddenly, but passes from a closed system to an open system, since that which has been set down becomes, dialectically, by the dogma of the infallibility of the head of the Church, the dogma of the necessary fallibility of all thought in matters of faith. Put succinctly thus, nothing which can be articulated here has any bearing on what abides there. This leads to a further raising of the level of abstraction. Kindly note that the distance between God and reason increases with the passage of time, everywhere, always. According to ancient revelation, God constantly interfered in everything. The righteous he bundled off to heaven, the wicked he doused with fire and brimstone. You could find him sitting behind any old bush. It was only later that the withdrawal began. God lost his visibility, his human shape, his beard. The audio-visual aids of miracles disappeared. So did the classroom demonstrations of transplanting demons into goats. So did the visitations of angel examiners. Faith, in a word, had dispensed with circus metaphysics. Thus, from the realm of the senses, it moved into the realm of abstractions. Nor then was there any shortage of proofs of his existence, of sanctions expressed in the language of higher algebra, of even more esoteric hermeneutics. These abstractions eventually reached the point at which God is pronounced dead, in order to achieve that cold, iron, devastating peace which belongs to the living when those most loved have forsaken them forever. The manifesto of the death of God is, then, the next maneuver, intended, however brutally, to spare us further metaphysical fatigue. To wit, we are alone, and do either what we like, or that to which future discoveries will lead us. But duism has gone beyond this. In it, you believe by doubting, and you doubt by believing. Yet this state, too, is not the final one. According to some of the prognostic brothers, the evolutions and revolutions, or, if you prefer, the turnings and upturnings of faith, do not follow the exact same course throughout the universe, and there are civilizations, powerful and great, that are attempting to organize an entire cosmogony in the context of an anti-God provocation. According to this hypothesis, there exist peoples among the stars who seek to break the terrible silence of God by throwing him the challenge, that is, the threat of cosmicide. Their idea is to have the whole universe converge at a single point and be consumed in the fires of that final spasm. They wish, as it were, by tipping God's work from its foundations, to force him into making some response. Though we have no definite knowledge of this, from the psychological standpoint, such a design does seem possible to me. Possible and at the same time futile. For engaging in an antimatter crusade against the Lord hardly seems a sensible way to open a dialogue with him. I couldn't refrain from observing that duism, as I saw it, was actually agnosticism, or perhaps atheism not absolutely certain of itself, or else a constant wavering between the poles of is and isn't. And even if it did contain a shred of faith, still, what purpose was served by the monastic life? Who, if anyone, benefited from this staying put in catacombs? Too many questions at once, said Father Dark. Have patience. And what exactly, in your opinion, should we be doing? What do you mean? There's always missionary work. Then you still understand nothing. You are as far from me now as you were at the moment of your first appearance, the prior said with sorrow. So you think we ought to occupy ourselves with the spreading of the faith, with missionary work, to evangelize, make converts. And you, Father, do not? How is that possible? Has this not been your mission throughout the ages? I asked, astonished. On Diatica, said the prior, 1,000,000 things are possible, things of which you have no knowledge. In one simple step we can erase the contents of a person's memory, and feed into that, thereby vacant mind, a new synthetic memory, such that it will appear to the subject that he has lived what he has not, experienced what he has not. In short, we can make him someone other than he was before the operation. We can change character and personality, transform lecherous brutes into mild Samaritans, and vice versa. Atheists into saints, and ascetics into sensualists. We can dull the wise, and the dull turn into geniuses. You must realize that all of this is very easy, and nothing material stands in the way of such conversions. And now give close heed to what I tell you. Yielding to the arguments of our preachers, a hidebound atheist might believe. Let us suppose that such silver-tongued emissaries from our order do convert various persons. The end state of these missionary measures would be such that as a result of the changes taken place in those minds, people who previously did not believe would now believe. This is clear, I think? I nodded. Good. And now observe that those persons will in matters of faith entertain new convictions, since by providing them with information through the medium of inspired words and evangelistic gestures, we have in a certain manner influenced their brains. Now this end state of brains infused with ardent faith and the longing for God may be achieved 1,000,000 times more quickly, and more reliably, too, by the application of a suitably selected range of biotic agents. Why, then, should we proselytize in the old-fashioned way, through persuasion, sermons, lectures, exhortations, when we have more modern means at our disposal? Surely you aren't serious, Father, I cried. That would be, well, unethical. The prior shrugged. You speak thus, for you are a child of another age. No doubt you think that we would act coercively, by the underhanded tactic of crypto-conversion, secretly sowing some sort of chemical or using certain waves or vibrations to reshape the mind. But it is not that way at all. At one time, disputes would take place between believers and non-believers, and the only instrument, the only weapon used then, was the verbal force of the argument of either side. I am not speaking of those disputes in which the argument consisted of the stake, the block, or the rack. Nowadays, an analogous dispute would take place with technological methods of argumentation. We would act with instruments of conversion, and hardened opponents would counter with methods designed to pattern us after their ideal, or at least to make themselves impervious to that form of evangelization. For either side, the chance of winning would depend on the effectiveness of the technology employed, just as, long ago, the chance of victory in a dispute depended on the effectiveness of one's verbal address. For conversion is nothing more or less than the conveying of faith-compelling information. Even so, I insisted, such conversion wouldn't be authentic. After all, a drug that produces the thirst for faith, the craving for God, falsifies the mind. It doesn't appeal to the will, but enslaves it, violates it. You forget where you are and to whom you speak, replied the prior. For 600 years there has been among us not a single natural mind. Thus it is impossible among us to distinguish between a thought spontaneous and a thought imposed, since no one need secretly impose a thought on anyone else in order to convince him. What is imposed is something which comes first, and at the same time has finality, the brain. But that imposed brain, too, possesses an integrity of logic, I said. True. Nevertheless, the equating of bygone and current disputes about God would cease to have foundation only if, in support of faith, there existed a proof logically incontrovertible, forcing the mind to accept its conclusion with a power equal to that wielded by mathematics. Yet, according to our Theodicy, no such proof can exist. Thus it is that the history of religion knows apostasies and heresies, but analogous defections are not encountered in the history of mathematics. For no one ever protested the fact that there is one way only to add unity to unity, and that the outcome of that operation is the number 2. But God you cannot demonstrate with mathematics. I will tell you of something that happened 200 years ago. A certain computer priest came into conflict with a computer non-believer. The latter, being a newer model, had at its disposal means of informational operation unknown to our good father. So it listened patiently to all his proofs and said, "You have informed me, and now I shall inform you, which will not take long. Let us then wait that bare millionth of a second for your transfiguration." Whereupon, in one remote-control flash, it informed our priest so thoroughly that he lost his faith. What say you now? "Well, if that was not an act of violation, I don't know what is," I exclaimed. "Among us, this sort of thing is called mind manipulation." "Mind manipulation," said Father Darg, "means the placing of invisible chains on the spirit in the same way that one can place them visibly on the body. Thoughts are like handwritten letters, and the manipulation of thought is like seizing the hand to make it put down other symbols. This is obvious coercion. But that computer did not act thus. Every proof must be built on facts. To convince by discussion, then, means simply to introduce, through words uttered, facts into the mind of the opponent. The computer did precisely this, though not with words. Therefore, from the informational point of view, it proceeded no differently than the ordinary debater of the past, the only difference being in the manner of transmission. It was able to do what it did, having the power to see the mind of our priest through and through. Imagine two chess players, one who can see only the board and the pieces, and one who in addition observes the thoughts of his adversary. The second will unfailingly beat the first, though without doing him violence in any way. What do you think we did with our father when he returned to us? I suppose you fixed him so that he could believe again, I said, uncertain. No, for he refused. Therefore, we could not do this. Now I don't understand a thing. After all, you would have been acting exactly as that adversary of his, only in reverse. Not at all. Not at all. Because our ex-priest had no desire for any further disputations. The concept of a disputation has changed and broadened considerably, you realize. He who now enters its lists must be prepared for more than words. Our priest displayed, alas, a most lamentable ignorance and naivete, for he had been warned, for that one had told him of its superiority in advance, but he just would not accept the fact that his unshakable faith could capitulate to anything. Theoretically, of course, there does exist a way out of this escalational dilemma, namely, to construct a mind capable of entertaining all variations of all possible facts. But since their class is of transfinite magnitude, only a transfinite mind could achieve metaphysical certainty. Such a mind it is impossible to build. For whatever we build in a finite fashion, and if there exists an infinite computer, it is he, and he alone. And so, at each new level of civilization, the debate about God not only may, but must be carried on with new technologies, if it is to be carried on at all. For the informational weaponry has changed on both sides equally. The situation in the event of battle would be symmetrical, and therefore identical to the situation that obtained in the medieval disputes. This new evangelism may be judged immoral only insomuch that you judge immoral the old converting of pagans, or the polemics of ancient theologians with atheists. No other mode of missionary work is now possible. For today he who is willing to believe will believe without fail, and he who has faith and wishes to cast it off will cast it off without fail, with the help of the appropriate procedures. So is it then possible to effect in turn the faculty of will, producing the desire for faith, I asked? It is indeed. As you know, someone once came up with the dictum that God stands on the side of the strongest battalions. Nowadays, in keeping with the idea of technogenic crusades, he would appear on the side that had the strongest conversional equipment. But we do not consider it our task to enter into this sort of Theodicean anti-religious arms race. We do not wish to involve ourselves in the kind of escalation where we develop a proselytizer and they an anti-proselytizer, where we convert and they controvert, and so on, contending century after century, turning the cloisters into factories of better and better means and tactics to awaken the thirst for faith. How can it be, I said, that there is no other road, Father, but this that you are showing me? Do not all minds have the same logic in common, the same natural intelligence? Logic is a tool, replied the prior, and a tool alone does nothing. It has to have a point of leverage and a guiding hand, and that leverage and that hand we are able to fashion entirely as we please. And as for natural intelligence, are the friars here natural? I already told you, we constitute scrap, and our credo is, to those who first constructed us and then discarded us, a side effect, the jabbering of scrap. We were given freedom of thought because the industry for which they fashioned us required that. Listen closely. I am now going to reveal to you a secret I would not reveal to any other. I know that you will leave us soon and not convey it to the authorities. It would cause us untold mischief. The brothers of one of the distant orders, who devote themselves to science, discovered a method of exercising such influence on the will and thought that in a twinkling of an eye we could convert the entire planet, there being no antidote against it. This method neither clouds nor dulls the reason, nor deprives one of one's freedom. It merely does to the spirit what is done to the sight by a hand that lifts the head skyward and a voice that cries, "Behold!" The sole constraint, coercion, would be at that moment the eyes could not be closed. This method compels one to look into the face of the enigma, and he who sees it thus shall never more be free of it, for the impression it makes, thanks to this method, is indelible. It would be as if, to use a simile, I were to bring you to the mouth of a volcano and induce you to look down, and the one constraint that I would place upon you then would be that you could never lose that memory. And therefore we are even now all-powerful in conversion, having reached, in the area of the spreading of the faith, the highest degree of mastery, as has been reached in another area, that of physical, corporeal invention by civilization. Thus we can, at long last, you understand. We have this missionary omnipotence, and yet do nothing. For now, the only way in which our faith can still be shown is to refuse to take that step. I say, above all, non agam, not merely non serviam, but also I shall not act. I shall not act because I can with certainty.